around this. I commend this bill to the House. We have done our job properly, Mr. Speaker.
Order. I call the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Every now and again, colleagues around the House get the opportunity to make contributions on debates that they feel really matter. Mr. Speaker, I'm the proud dad of two wonderful young sons, and every week when I come down to this place, like many other colleagues, occasionally I feel a little wistful about leaving them behind in Auckland or wherever we come from. But the reason that I'm keen to take a call on this debate is actually for them, because climate change is a fact, not a philosophy, not a political statement, a scientifically verified fact. There is debate about whether we're going to get 1 degree or 6 degrees difference over the next century or so, and that may make the difference between the continuation of the human species or not. Small point, extinction for us. And it just happens to be in the lifetime of my two little boys or their children. And so we have the bizarre and frankly disgusting picture of a government so craven to its traditional agricultural and big business backers that is selling out the future of my children and your children and even their own children because they are somewhere between being confused about science that puts a 95% plus confidence on this change, and by being craven to the business interests who they serve in this House. Mr. Speaker, neither reason is good enough, neither reason is right, and neither reason actually is even in the long-term interests of this economy. Because weakening the ETS to the extent that there is no minimum floor on a carbon price, to the extent that half of our emissions, the agricultural and primary sectors, are left out, to the extent that there is a 2-for-1 giveaway subsidy on our carbon debits, Mr. Speaker, those changes gut the ETS. They are going to result in clear felling of more timber, the destruction of more sinks. They are going to result in an underinvestment in clean technology. They are going to result in New Zealanders paying more in our lifetime and our children's lifetime to adjust to the climate change that is certain, not probable, but certain to come. Now, we have a choice. We can use integrity, science, and a dash of political courage to say what we know to be true, that our future will not be easier than our present. Our future in relation to climate change will be a damn sight more difficult. New Zealand, it is true, and others have said it, will be relatively less affected than many other countries, but it is little cheer to know that we're going to be relatively less affected than countries like Chad or Somalia, who are going to face mass famine. People will die in their millions. Here, we will just put up with tornadoes, thunderstorms, droughts, floods and reduced agricultural production, and may I say, more turbulent flights into Wellington. That's known as a first world problem, Mr. Speaker. More turbulent flights into Wellington, not one I enjoy particularly, but hey, no one's going to die, we hope. But people are going to die around the rest of the world, and we are going to face refugee flows into New Zealand as a result. We're going to find our markets contracting on us, and we're going to find it more difficult to export to people who have far bigger problems than we do. So what can we do? Mr. Speaker, in the face of a party that has rolled over and said tickle my tummy to traditional business interests, has flown in the face of established science, Mr. Speaker, Labor is proposing 4 important supplementary order papers. Mr. Speaker, the first of those is to restore the entry date of agriculture to the legislation so that it will continue to enter in 2015. Mr. Speaker, that will provide certainty, it will provide some incentives for proper investment in clean technology, and it will help agriculture to adjust by giving it a longer time period to adjust over. Mr. Speaker, nearly 70% of submitters to the Select Committee were opposed to excluding agriculture from the ETS. Bring it in on schedule, all sectors, all gases. Let's have an ETS that actually achieves its objective, which is to achieve a given level of carbon reduction at the minimum economic cost. That's what an all sectors, all gases scheme will do. The second SOP is to restrict international limits to 50% so that New Zealand units are preferred over international ones, thus protecting sinks in New Zealand like the forestry industry. That is the same standard that is applied to the Australian scheme. Mr. Speaker, it's well known that many of the carbon credits that are sourced from offshore, particularly one might say Eastern Europe and other places, are perhaps worth less than the paper that they are milled on. Mr. Speaker, to make the transition period changes those recommended by the panel, the carbon price cap would increase under Labor's SOPs by $5 each year to $50 rather than remaining at $25. The 2-for-1 deal would be phased out over 3 years rather than being continued indefinitely. And finally, Mr. Speaker, our SOPs would have the Environmental Protection Authority publish annually the amount industries charge their customers for carbon, and that will allow the public to know when they are being overcharged. Mr. Speaker, we acknowledge that both the world and domestic economies remain weak. Mr. Speaker, we understand that there is turmoil in world carbon markets and that the carbon price has substantially declined. But, Mr. Speaker, if people look closer than today's price, they will see that the price of carbon futures is high relative to the current price. That is, the markets are betting carbon is going up again. And when it does, New Zealand will face substantial international debit liabilities because the current government has failed to take the opportunity to put in place a scheme that is robust, workable and coherent, let alone comprehensive. Mr. Speaker, instead what is happening here is we have a government which is knowingly selling out the future of all our children. It is knowingly flying in the face of established science. Mr. Speaker, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the largest research body behind climate change. It involves thousands of scientists. It is mandated by the United Nations. Its fourth assessment report in 2007 found that the probability that the climate change, which is already well documented, is simply natural, is less than 5%. That is, we know with a 95% plus confidence interval it's not only happening, but human endeavour is causing it, and therefore human endeavour has to change unless these lovely kids up in the gallery are going to pick up the price tag for stuff that we failed to do. We look them in the eyes and we say, kids, I'm sorry, your life is going to be more difficult because adults today failed to have the foresight and the courage to write laws that would make our economy and our environment better when you grow up. And I look to every parent in this house and I ask you to ask yourselves, is that right? Is that the best we can do? Is that why we get up on a Monday or a Tuesday morning and fly to Wellington? Mr. Speaker, I hope not. I hope that all of us, whatever our party, whatever our persuasions in this house, we have the foresight and the courage to ask ourselves how as a country we should respond to this challenge that is inevitably coming at us like a rushing freight train through a tunnel. Mr. Speaker, we can see a light ahead. We know the noise. We know we're in a rail tunnel. We know climate change is happening. We know that half of our emissions are from the agriculture sector, and yet this government wants to leave agriculture out. We know that in the long term, it's better for the economy as well as the environment if business has appropriate price signals. But this government's giving a 2-for-1 discount and seeing the carbon price go to zero. Mr. Speaker, we know it's going to be in our fiscal interests. That is, it's going to cost New Zealand less as a country if we build up our carbon sinks so that we have a positive net balance, that our sinks outweigh our sources. Mr. Speaker, this bill doesn't do that. It does the reverse. By gutting the carbon price and leaving out agriculture, it leaves our foresters with no incentives to plant. Mr. Speaker, we know that it will be better if business itself invests to mitigate the worst challenges and to give itself a decent long adjustment curve. But Mr Speaker, this bill doesn't contain any incentives for any chief executive to go to their board and say, I want to install a scrubber on my smokestack. I want to invest in clean technology. I want to invest in R&D that will help my processes work better as well as being better for the environment. I want to become a clean green exporter and help New Zealand to be a clean, green and clever country. There are no incentives. In fact, it will be harder and harder for businesses to do what's right. Think of our children, think of these children. Government, you should be ashamed.
Mr Speaker.
I call the honourable member Kennedy Graham.